Welcome to The Nature of Work, a podcast brought to you by Mindbox Studios and Icon Coaching.
This is Josh.
This is Kirk. We are a couple of consultants who have been working in the new economy for a decade or more. And during that time, it has become abundantly clear that the nature of work has changed. What do we mean by that? Well, there's a lot to that statement, but for now, let's say that the internet has reordered how value itself is created and delivered in an increasing number of fields. This has happened over the last 30-odd years or so. And with more and more people working remotely and in teams diffused across multiple time zones, it appears that how we work is finally catching up to the internet revolution. Morning, Josh. How's your remote office doing today?
It is doing quite well this morning. I am prepared for work. I am wearing shoes and everything.
So am I. I actually have my favorite pair of boots on, which is my most common fall, winter, spring attire for work. It's mindset, man. It's about mindset.
It is. But I do feel ready for work, though, so there's that.
Well, welcome to work. Josh, what do you want to talk about today?
So I think the next logical thing to talk about in this series, once we've covered the technology, is how we use that to actually communicate with the people that are on our teams, whether we're managing them, they're managing us, or we're peers. How do we do that? It's a completely different environment with completely different rules, it feels like, and those rules probably feel pretty unknown.
It is interesting how we're often working with the same people doing the same work, but just the change of location can cause this communication thing to break down or sort of falter, because while it feels like it should be the same, it just isn't. And we have to make adjustments to figure out, how do you communicate with people now that we're not next door, across the aisle, across the, in the same office space, where we're not parking together, walking into the office together. Those are also rituals of the morning, sort of checking in, how was your weekend, and settling into workflows together. And we now don't have that. So how do we do work remotely and still maintain connection and really solid communication?
And as part of that, the part of those daily rituals go unrecognized in terms of their effect. A lot of people that I've been talking to lately who are working remotely or managing remotely for the first time are talking about anxiety. And at first it was a little bit strange for me, because I feel a great liberation, a great freedom, and a great comfort in working remotely, and I don't really want to go back from that necessarily. I really enjoy it. And I started thinking about it, and I started to get that anxiety, because that social distance that we start to experience online as well as in person leads to us being unaware of what's going on. We don't know what our boss is thinking. We can't see their face. We don't know if they know that we're working, and they're feeling like they don't know if you're working. And
Right.
and that creates a lot of anxiety on everybody on the team. So how do we take all of those things and come up with a new structure, a new framework, and maybe even a new mindset about communication now that we're all remote?
So the first tip we want to give you today is, when you move into a non-proximal or a remote workspace, is that you have to actually crank up the communication. It's actually going to feel like over communication to start with.
Right. For those of you who are worried about what your employees are doing, over communication to them is also going to create space for them to be constantly keeping you in the loop about how they're doing along the way and what progress they're making on things. And it's going to feel a little bit less in the dark. And so that has to start at the top of the team. So as part of communicating top down and is making sure that everybody is in the loop.
Right.
Because the easiest thing to slide into, what'll feel like the new normal, is everybody feeling out of the loop. And that comes to a number of different things. The boss, if you're leading a team, you're thinking, I don't know what my people are doing. Are they doing laundry? Are they actually working? Are they accomplishing things? And most of the work that happens remotely has deliverables, but those deliverables aren't necessarily a product of time. If you are in a factory and you're producing widgets and you produce X widgets per hour, you can easily look at the widgets and say, did productivity go up or down? If you're looking at something that is inherently some type of intellectual product, whether that's design or writing, an art form of any kind, any type of consulting work, or any of the things that probably most of us are doing that we're doing remotely now, they don't have that, and we can't look at that. And we used to have this mindset that was totally wrong about, if they're in the office, then they're productive. Like, this is productive time. I know that because I can see them.
Right, they're sitting at their desk tending their machine,
Right.
but that's an industrial age mindset, right?
Exactly, because the machine isn't cranking out widgets.
If the machine
Right.
is running, we're making product. It's different
Mhm.
today.
Exactly. And so but that tends to be how we think about it. So we have
Yeah,
to understand first that we were wrong to think that. And so that now we're looking remotely, we need to be looking at what honestly we should have been looking at before, which
that's right.
isn't necessarily a quantity of widgets, but it's looking at outcomes. It's, what are we trying to accomplish as a team? And are we accomplishing those things as a team? And choosing to let go a little bit about how you get there.
It's amazing how much information is embedded just in being able to scan an office. You get up and you do a walk around an office building where, say, you have 10, 20, 30 employees, and you can see them, and you can see that they're talking or in communication or typing or working or printing, and it gives us a comfort level that, okay, everybody's here and they're working. All of a sudden, when everybody's working remotely, you can't see that. And so when you're sitting there as a leader or as a team member and you can't see what other people are doing, all of a sudden there's all these holes in your perceptions. And it's very easy to fill those with conspiracy theories like they must be watching Netflix because I haven't gotten an email from them in an hour. So we have to have different protocols of how do you actually engage this communication. One of the things I like to think about is what I call a door jam conversation. Say you have an office and somebody comes in and they want to have a brief chat or they want to share an idea. It's a little seed of something. And they come up to your door jam and the door's closed. That's a piece of communication. Don't bother me right now. I'm in a meeting. I'm doing something that requires focus. Please don't interrupt. And so if you're going to actually interrupt a closed door, it needs to be really important. And sometimes that's right. But if the door is open, it says, yeah, check it out. Come on in. See what I'm up to. I'm open to being interrupted. So you lean against the door jamb and you share this seed of a thought. And that seed of a thought might be a 3-minute conversation, or it might become something that lasts all the afternoon. But there's a way in which we communicate very, very subtly about how to do that. Like there's a, come on in, let's talk about this more, have a seat. And then postures change and all this. And then diagrams start being drawn. And all of a sudden, you know that you've been invited into a longer conversation. But online, where's the door jam? How do you even initiate that? What are the practices that allow us to go from a 3-minute interruption to an all afternoon, really deep brainstorm session?
Right. That's interesting, because we're looking at, taking something that felt like one tool. I am talking to somebody who's 6 feet away from me, and knowing that there is this quick thing and this long thing, right? And so, and we go from thinking that that's one tool to, in the socially distant remote work space, having that literally be different tools.
Right.
Right, even though it's not the same tool. Having a quick conversation with somebody in person is fundamentally different. The way we talk about things is different. How we choose to allow distractions is different. How we read the other person's engagement is very, very different. So we are leveraging a completely different tool set. We've just gotten used to it. And the same thing happens in the digital world. And that's why I think one of the most important things to do is, when you're looking at whether it's formal communication or informal communication, all those different protocols that you're talking about, is to actually create rules that are really just based on the communication tools that you have available, which is another way of saying you have to have multiple communications tools.
Right.
And your primary one, I'm sorry, is not going to be email. Like, that's going to be our default, because if we were remote right now, we would communicate by email. That's just what we did in the office before. I can't shout to you, so I'm gonna type it in an email. But email probably needs to fall by the wayside as something, okay, we use for external communication sometimes, or for things that need to be memorialized. Excuse me, that need to be memorialized in a certain way.
Yeah, email is very formal communication.
Yes, that's a great way of
And
structuring
it's
it. Yes,
useful as, here, I'm going to send the agenda for the thing or a copy of a document that is finalized or all those sort of things. It's
exactly.
memorializing it into formal communication.
And you can use those as even an MOU of sorts, right? Where you can say, like, this is what I understood. Are we on the same page? And you kind of have that crystallized, and it feels very real and formal because it is.
That's right. But how do you don't email somebody a, "Hey, got time for a phone call?"
No, nor do you email somebody just a fun GIF
No, we
because
used to.
you found it. We used to.
It was terrible.
It was awful. There was I remember a few years ago, the first company that I ever really did any substantive work with that had both a remote culture and this really intense interest in GIFs. And so GIFs were a thing, and of course I knew about them, and but I never really engaged in this was definitely years ago, but I never really engaged with that process. It wasn't a thing. And so when they started just showing up in emails, because that was one of our principal means of communication was email, they would just start showing up emails, and I started rolling my eyes. A few months into it, I was actually like all in on the GIFs, and we would have these email threads that were literally like 30 messages long, and 22 of those messages were just GIF replies to different types of things. But we don't do that anymore. But we
We
do.
don't. So what tools do we use today? What are we recommending?
Yeah, so there you definitely want something that's less formal and more instant. And there are a number of ways to approach this. So one of the more common ways is to use a tool called Slack. Slack is practically ubiquitous in the world of remote work. Slack is a tool for teams that has instant messaging between person to person and groups of people, as well as defined channels that you can set about with by topic. So you can have
What
something
do you mean
for
by channel? What does that mean in this context?
so in this, it's like a channel with your television in the sense that we're going to say, okay, this is our marketing channel, and all messages that we need to broadcast to people who are interested in marketing will go on the marketing channel. And
So
those
it's
who
a way of
subscribe,
grouping large conversations?
I would actually say it's not even grouping conversations, it's grouping messages, because a conversation implies that there are boundaries to it, and a channel has no boundaries. And that's actually something that's really interesting because there are actually, I'm going to come back to that in just a second because I want to say more about that. But
Okay.
the idea that that Slack has conversations is a little bit misleading. Slack is really, really awesome for getting quick answers to things, for saying, I have this question, do you have an answer? And then you get a quick answer to that. Or hey, do you have that proposal for that client done yet? Oh yeah, here's a link, right? Doing things like that, Slack is great for. Or for having, like when I was talking about a marketing channel, that may be something like, hey, the new website is up, here's a link. Or we launched this new landing page, or here's this new piece of collateral, and drop it in there because you get this running record. You can think of it in a lot of ways, like looking at a Twitter feed of everything that happened in marketing, right? But it's notice what I'm not talking about in there are these long in-depth conversations, because though a lot of us, myself included, will use Slack for that, I actually don't think it's super well suited for those kinds of conversations. We're going to go back and forth for a long period of time. And
Mm.
that is the nature of the way the tool itself is structured. It's structured for broadcast, which is why they use words like channels. And that's why you can have direct messages. So I could send you, Kirk, a message, and you could go back and we could have that own conversation that kind of goes back and forth, and then when we both stop talking, the conversation, I'm air quoting here, the conversation is done. But in a larger channel, there's a lot more people involved. There isn't a conversation. There are other tools that try to approach that differently. One of them that I actually rather like is called Twist. And they are like Slack, but instead they actually do structure it as conversations. So you have something that's akin to a channel. So you could have something that's marketing, but inside of there are actual conversations, which you can think of, if you are familiar with Slack, you can do it as threads on steroids. So
Mhm.
it's a way of saying that, like, we're going to talk about something, and we're going to talk about it maybe at length, and it's going to resolve at some point, and that's going to be filed away in that channel. So it's got some components of email to it. And one of the things that they do differently, that is a cultural play that they try to set themselves apart from something like Slack, is in saying that it's not entirely about instant. It's about thinking through a reply and figuring out, what do I want to say, and then writing down what I want to say, like you would with email. Um, and so whether or not, I don't recommend using two different tools for things like that. That would be silly. But whatever tool you do, you want to understand that there are two different things that could happen there. There's this idea of, I want to broadcast out information, or I want to get access to a quick question, which are all just very snap your fingers, I'm going to throw this out into the ether and see what happens. And then the flip side of that is actually engaging in a conversation that has an aim, where there's back and forth and discussion and things like that. And you want to go about the process of structuring those things with intention. I've kind of gone down a rabbit hole here when I was just talking about the tools to use, but
Well, but
um,
what it really highlights to me as I'm listening to you is that we use voice, talk, right? This idea of talk to cover a wide variety of types of communication. And in the online world, we actually have to use different tools for that. And so there are tools designed, and we have to go out and learn how to use them. So we have things
Yeah.
like email, we have things like Slack and Twist. We have things like Zoom, which is video conferencing, which everybody all of a sudden is like literally changing Zoom's world right now. It's amazing. Um, and then there's the phone. Where
Yeah.
does text fit into that? Texting each other.
So I think text fits into the same place that it probably always has, that it's something that is informal. It's usually considered off the record, right? That's our protocol. It's bad form to use text as the formal record of something, right? Like
Right,
showing somebody a screenshot of like, haha, you said this back in March 1st.
right.
There are cases when that's appropriate, but there are probably attorneys involved or something. And but so
That's
it's
where something very bad has happened and broken down in communication.
right, exactly. But for routine things, it's oftentimes about an availability question.
Yeah.
So look, I use email very intentionally. I will check my email a few times per day, but I am not on email constantly. And that is actually something that I highly recommend, by the way, for those who work in an office too, but is to have time where you do your email because it can become a constant distraction. And at home, where things can, at least at first, feel like they're lacking the structure we used to have, putting structure and setting up new normals and routines for yourself, like saying I'm going to check email at 8 in the morning, and I'm going to check it at 10, I'm going to check it at 2, and then I'm going to check it before I go to bed, right? Like, or something like that, whatever your structure is. Doing that up can be really, really beneficial. So I only do email at certain times of the day. It's not a way to get a hold of me quickly.
Mhm.
Slack is, of course, better for something like that because you can just send me a quick message. But also, I consider Slack non urgent. So I will leave Slack messages sitting there for a while unless I'm expecting something, right? Like if I know that there's a time sensitive thing out there that involves somebody from my team and that person happens to message me and I see that, I'll probably check. Otherwise, I consider it non essential. I don't check it uh, in a
Non-urgent, still might be essential, right?
Correct. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, non-urgent, yeah.
Non-urgent, but yes, probably essential. Unless it's again just random gifs people are sending me, in which case that's also fun. But I don't do it as structured as email, where I'm going to check it a few times a day. I actually check it very regularly, but I don't care at all if there is an hour gap where I don't check Slack, or a 90-minute gap where I don't check Slack. Text messaging is not that way. Text messaging is like somebody really poking me and saying, this is what you mentioned, the idea of like the door being closed. You would text me when it's like, I need to get a message through that door without bursting through it,
That's right.
right?
It's the
So
knock on the door, right? "Hey, I'm willing to interrupt you because I believe what I need is as important or more important than what you're currently doing. And if I'm wrong, you can let me know, but I'm gonna risk it."
right, exactly. So that's where I think text messaging fits into that. So we've mentioned text, we've mentioned Slack and other chat tools, we've mentioned video, we haven't mentioned phone calls.
I think phone calls are at the bottom of the list. Personally, I don't answer my phone. If you're calling me, I'm pretty sure that you don't understand how to work remotely, that you're part of the old economy, and I just that's where phone calls live for me. Occasionally, well, say it this way, when I answer my phone, I've had clients who are like, "Holy smoke, I can't believe you answered your phone. I feel so honored." Right? I actually took a phone call from them. So that's where I put phone calls. Bottom of the list, mostly irrelevant. I would much rather put a phone call into a Zoom conversation.
So that's interesting. So the judgment, the intense judgment you feel when that phone rings for whoever name shows up on the screen, it comes from that's coming from a place of knowing that there is a tool that accomplishes what phones do plus.
That's how I feel about it. So what a phone call does is it says, "I need to talk to you right now, and I need you to respond right now. Like, I need your absolute attention, and you have to stop doing everything else." If you can put that into a text or a Slack message, I can actually be doing something else while I'm working with you on. So if I'm in a meeting and my wife calls me, that's hard. But if she texts me, I can actually see what she needs. I can prioritize it. I can
Right.
understand what to do with it. And I can even, in just the briefest moment, just go click, 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 bum, and respond. and the person I'm in the meeting with isn't going to be interrupted or offended. They don't have to break their flow of thought. Now, if I get into a long back and forth with someone via text in the middle of a meeting, that's an interruption. So
Right.
I personally don't have a ton of value for the phone call unless I know I'm working with somebody where that's actually their primary form of communication, and then I'll adjust to them.
Okay, so this brings up something interesting. I think another mindset shift. We have a phrase in English, and you just used it a moment ago, of pick up the phone, right? Where like, oh, I need an answer for you, I'm going to pick up the phone. And I think for a lot of people, when they start out doing video conferencing, there's a formality to it. There's maybe a calendar invitation that goes out, and there's a link in there to do it, or I'm going to go log into Zoom or go to meeting or whatever. I'm going to create this meeting, and then I'm going to send it to somebody. It's like, how is that possibly better than just grabbing my phone and tapping your face, right? Like it's just, it feels really different. But this is where technology can actually help a lot in these cases, because you can use, like, Zoom is not as great at that, I think, as some other video tools. Like Skype is much better for just like tapping on somebody's face and making a video call. But if you have communications tools like Slack that you use, Slack has what they call integrations, where you can connect to other services. And so we have some that connected to our Slack at Mindbox that allow us to do a few things like this. So one is I can type or they call them slash commands because they begin with a forward slash, right? So I can type a slash command that will just open up a video with the person that I'm in the message with. And that can be a channel, it can be a direct message or whatever. So I was like, oh, I want to talk to this person. I can just tap right there, slash meet, enter, and it sends them a Google Meet invite. My browser window opens, and we're in a meeting. And it's basically the same as the phone, except I didn't have to pick up my phone, right?
Right.
It's like texting
And
from my computer.
now I'm doing what we traditionally do with a phone, but I have the visual.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
we know about communication when doing back and forth communication, there's three elements to that. One is the actual content of the words being spoken. That's the lowest amount of the encoded communication. The second lowest is tone, which you can get both of those from a phone, the actual words and the tone of the words. But I can't remember the number, you might know it, but it's like 70% of communication is body language.
Right.
So if I have a video option, why would I forego that with a phone? Now we have decades of experience learning in our minds, knowing how to translate phone calls into better communication. But man, if I can push it into a video conference, I will.
And so, like, what I said may have just sounded intimidating, that like slash commands and doing all that. Just know those are convenience features. They're not
Yeah.
necessary features, right? So over time, you can use those to lower the barrier to get down to the pick up the phone, but you don't need to do that right away. But there's lots of other ways to unlock that technology too. Another thing that I do sometimes, we have one that allows us to leave voice memos. So if I'm
Mhm.
like, I have typed something out, but it's going to be a jarbled mess, and it's going to be 6 paragraphs long, because I'm processing in real time, but I don't want to take the time to do like this full internal processing and then draft a formal message and then send that. Like that feels way overloaded for Slack. Then I can just do that and click record, and I'll just vomit it all out
Mhm.
into a thing that takes them 30 seconds to listen to or 45 seconds to listen to. And then they can process that on their own and do that, and it saves everybody time. So it's another way of just doing something like that that's also asynchronous.
There are tools like Voxer and Marco Polo that are designed just for that kind of communication. And one of the teams that I've been working with as a coach for years has had a heavy reliance on Voxer because they're driving around a lot. And so when you're driving, you of course don't want to be typing, but you can do voice memos.
Hmm. And there are ones that do video too, so you can actually record like you talking into the camera, which is also beneficial for those types of things.
So the other thing that I run into on this subject of the tools is where I'm more forward facing out towards customers. I also have to pay attention to social media channels because I have people that reach out to me through Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram or places like that, and so I'm having to track, understand where my forward facing channels are. And I missed one on Instagram. No, I'm sorry, it was LinkedIn, where I hadn't been to LinkedIn for a couple of weeks, and in that process, somebody reached out to me, someone I know. They used that channel to reach out to me to say, hey, we're doing this statewide initiative. It's this big project. And they were inviting me to come help collaborate or participate with the project. And I was just late to the game because I hadn't checked LinkedIn in a while. And so you've got to keep social channels as a way of connecting to customers who aren't necessarily part of your team. But when your customers are also remote and using these tools to communicate, it's not like the old days where they went to the yellow pages, found your phone number, and called you. And that's how everybody communicated. So now we've got 7, 8, 9 different very, very useful ways of talking with each other, both as teams, but also with our customers and our vendors. And we have to be paying attention to all of them, which brings us to sort of the final sort of tip. How do you set up a environment where all of those different channels, all those different tools are working cohesively? And it's very helpful to actually have rules of engagement and make these things explicit within your culture. What is email for? What is Slack for? What is text for? What is phone? What is video? And set some parameters on that so that everybody is somewhat operating under the same protocols.
Right, right. We actually codify some of those things in our employee handbook. So
Hmm.
we say what those kinds of communication tools are for. We say that we don't use email unless we have to, for our internal communications, because that's not how we want our culture reflected,
Yeah.
or that's not how we want. That's not an accurate reflection of our culture. I guess is a better way to say that. But there are lots of like little things that you're going to have to figure out as a team how you want to handle. And so some of those rules are, how do you know when you're available, or if you know, not only the when but the how, right? So if uh, we're working remotely and that's leading to people flexing their schedules differently, we might just have people working when other people aren't, even though everybody's working the same number of hours in aggregate. So you need to be really clear with your teammates about when you're working, and you need to be clear how it's best to reach you. So,
Hmm.
like I was saying before, that people who work with me know that if it is non-urgent but they want a response today, they'll Slack me about it. If it is urgent, they will text me about it, because we've set that expectation, and that's largely the same across our whole organization. But that's something that's evolved over time. We've decided that's how we want to prioritize things, and we know that there are certain exceptions. So, we have some people who are a little bit more checked out of the day-to-day grind in our organization. So we know that Slack is a dumb way to try to get a hold of them. They will a week can go by and it's your LinkedIn again if we don't
Yeah.
ever get a hold of them. So it's like text or a phone call or something like that. It's exactly how we have to get a hold of them. So just understanding how and when.
Yeah. That is super important. And I think one of the things that we want to really communicate is if you're new as a manager, director, or participant of a team into this environment, you got to understand that you have an embedded culture about how you communicate when you're all in the same building. And it's somewhat ubiquitous. You don't even have to think about it. You've been doing it for decades. And all of a sudden, you might find yourself in a remote environment. And there can be this idea of, oh my gosh, this is hard. I want to go back, but in the going back you're going to lose a lot of the value of being able to work remotely. It is worth taking some time to adjust culture because you will unlock all sorts of amazing opportunities in doing so. And that brings us to our bonus, like the big idea for this communication. Peter Drucker, famous professor and consultant, that introduced us to the idea of the knowledge worker. He recognized that when making these sort of shifts, that what we're really talking about is strategy. What is the strategy that we're going to use in order to communicate in this new world? However, you already have a culture, and culture eats strategy for breakfast. He's famous for saying that. What does that mean? What it means is your culture won't even let your new strategy show up to work without consuming it. So you have to do the work not only of introducing the strategies and these rules of engagements and these tools, but you've got to do culture work to let people have time to transition, to learn how to make changes that they may or may not really be excited about. And you got to build a benefit to it. These are the things that allow us to actually communicate well online. And if we don't do this, all kinds of negative misunderstandings, miscommunications are going to build into our system, and we're going to actually not be able to create the value that we're looking to create for our customers.
So to recap, we've talked about an awful lot in this very short period of time. The highlight that we started with is over communicate, over communicate, over communicate, over communicate. It's going to be redundant. lean into that redundancy. If it just feels like you're going too far, you haven't gone far enough. Until people tell you to stop sending stuff, you're not going too far. And the reason is that it's not as clear when you're not in person that there's buy-in. So over communicate. Can't really emphasize that enough. Be redundant with it. Understand that the new remote world is not different than the old world. It's the exact same protocols. They're just done a little differently. How do you find a different way of accomplishing the same thing?
Right.
And there's answers for all of those. Always lean into your tools for that. Have different means of tools to handle different kinds of communication in different ways. So have formal ways of communicating like email, informal ways of communicating like through Slack, engage with video calling and those kinds of things so that you really get a lot of ways of interacting with somebody, and have expectations around how that's supposed to work. And codify all of that into some at least shared understanding, if not a formal document that says, here's the rules of engagement. Here's how we're going to go about this. When is each person available? How are they available? How's it best to reach them? And what are expectations around those things inside the organization? And then also, just like you do with customers, how does that reflect externally as well? There are probably expectations about if your client leaves you a voicemail or your client emails you, right? How fast you're going to get back to them. We need to have those same things for our internal team. And remember that all of that stuff, everything about communication is about culture and about establishing a good remote working culture. And if you do that well, the organization sings and you'll be more productive than you've ever been before. And if you don't, the best laid strategy is just going to the remote workforce to die.
Well, hopefully that helps on communication and sets up some expectations of how to set that up well. The next thing that sort of leads right behind that is, okay, now we're working remotely and we've got the tools and the rules of engagement, but how do we use them to actually lead a team? How do you facilitate teams well in a remote environment? And stick with us, and you're going to get that in episode 3 of The Nature of Work. The Nature of Work is co-hosted by Josh Miller and Kirk Wayman. You can connect with Josh at mindboxstudios.com, and Kirk is available at iconcoaching.com. You can also find us by searching The Nature of Work on Facebook, where we'd love to connect with you and you can join the conversation. Our theme music is a Scott Holmes original, sound edited by CW Sound.